The blood-stained letter trembled in Flora Evans's hand as she stepped off the stagecoach into the dusty streets of Placerville, California. In the summer of 1876, the last connection to a life she could never return to, and a grim reminder of why she'd fled Boston in the first place. The journey west had drained her last reserves of strength and courage. 3 weeks of lurching coaches, questionable meals, and fitful sleep had left her hollow-eyed and weary. The constant fear of discovery had frayed her nerves to breaking. Now, standing in a town she'd only read about in newspaper columns, Flora clutched her single valise and tried to steady her breathing. Placerville was nothing like the refined society she'd abandoned. The main street bustled with an odd assortment of humanity miners with weathered faces, merchants calling their wares, ladies of questionable repute lounging in doorways, and cowboys sauntering between saloons. The scents of horse manure, wood smoke, and whiskey hung in the air. "First time in Placerville, miss." The stagecoach driver handed down her trunk, his eyes curious beneath the brim of his hat. "Yes," Flora replied simply, unwilling to invite further questions. Her Eastern accent would attract enough attention without volunteering information. "Gold Rush days are mostly behind us now, but it's still a lively town." He gestured toward a white-painted building across the street. "Harper's boarding house takes in respectable ladies. Mrs. Harper runs a tight establishment." Flora nodded her thanks, gathering her skirts to navigate the unpaved street. Her fine leather boots, perfectly suitable for Boston's cobblestone streets, were already gathering dust. The late afternoon sun beat down on her inappropriately heavy traveling dress, and sweat trickled uncomfortably down her spine beneath layers of fabric and corset stays. The boarding house appeared clean, if modest. A handwritten sign in the window advertised rooms for rent. Flora squared her shoulders and approached the door, reminding herself that beggars couldn't be choosers. And she was, in fact, very nearly a beggar. The money sewn into the lining of her trunk wouldn't last forever. Mrs. Harper proved to be a stout, gray-haired woman with shrewd eyes that assessed Flora's quality dress and obvious exhaustion in equal measure. "Room's 50 cents a night includes breakfast. Extra for supper. No gentlemen callers, no liquor, no coming in after 9. "That's acceptable," Flora said, placing coins on the counter. "I'll take it for a week to start." The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, washstand, and window overlooking the back garden. Flora sat heavily on the bed once Mrs. Harper departed, finally allowing her rigid posture to collapse. The letter crinkled in her pocket, and she withdrew it with trembling fingers. The bloodstains had dried to a rusty brown now, obscuring some of the words penned by her father's hand. It didn't matter, she'd memorized every devastating syllable. Her family's fortune lost, her father's suicide, her fiancé's hasty withdrawal, and finally the whispered accusations that would have seen her arrested had she stayed in Boston. Flora pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, refusing to cry again. She'd done enough weeping on the journey west. Now she needed to find a way to survive. The next morning, after a restless night, Flora set out to seek employment. Her prospects were limited. Despite her expensive education, her practical skills were few. She could play piano, speak French, paint watercolors, and embroider handkerchiefs, none of which seemed particularly useful in a former gold rush town. By midday, she'd been turned away from the mercantile, the hotel, and the dressmaker's shop. The bank manager had looked her up and down in a way that made her skin crawl before suggesting she might find other work at the Red Garter Saloon. Flora had fled without responding. Her feet ached in her inappropriate boots and hunger gnawed at her stomach. She'd skipped breakfast, too nervous to eat, and now regretted it. Standing in the shade of the livery stable, she dabbed at her perspiring forehead with a handkerchief and considered her dwindling options. "You look like you're about to faint, madam." The voice startled her. A tall man leaned against the stable door, arms crossed over a broad chest. He wore the practical clothing of a working man, worn denim trousers, a blue cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal tanned forearms, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. Not a gentleman, but not a common laborer either. "I'm perfectly fine, thank you," Flora replied stiffly, straightening her posture. He stepped forward, and she could see his face more clearly, weathered by sun and wind, with a strong jaw darkened by stubble and remarkably blue eyes that studied her with undisguised interest. He wasn't handsome in the polished way Boston men were, but there was something compelling about the quiet strength in his bearing. "Quinn Blackburn," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I don't believe we've met, Miss Evans, Flora Evans." She offered no further information. He nodded as if her reticence was expected. "New to town, just arrived yesterday," she admitted. There was no point denying the obvious, and already looking for work, I'd wager. His perception unsettled her. Placerville isn't kind to newcomers without connections. Flora lifted her chin. "I'm quite capable of managing my affairs, Mr. Blackburn." A smile tugged at his mouth. "No doubt, but I happen to be in need of help myself. My housekeeper left last month to get married, and I haven't had time to replace her. It's just temporary work, mind you, but it pays fair and includes room and board on my ranch." Flora's immediate instinct was to refuse. A single woman didn't accept employment in a bachelor's home without risking her reputation. But she was running out of options, and her dwindling funds made her desperate. "I don't have experience as a housekeeper," she said honestly. Quinn Blackburn shrugged. "Can you cook, clean? I'm not particular, Miss Evans. The place just needs a woman's touch." "How far is this ranch?" she asked, still hesitant. "About 5 miles west of town. Good water, decent grazing land." He gestured vaguely toward the mountains. "I've got a supply wagon here heading back this afternoon if you're interested." Flora considered her choices. Return to the boarding house and deplete her savings while continuing a likely fruitless job search, or accept this man's offer and at least have room and board secured while she developed a longer-term plan. "I would need references," she said firmly, clinging to propriety. He looked amused. "Sheriff Dawson can vouch for me. I'm a boring cattle rancher, Miss Evans, not an outlaw. But if it makes you feel better, I'll introduce you to Reverend Clark's wife before we leave town. She helps organize the church socials. I never attend." 2 hours later, after an awkward interview with the minister's wife, who confirmed that Quinn Blackburn was a good Christian man, if rather solitary, and a hasty retrieval of her belongings from the boarding house, Flora found herself perched on the seat of a wagon beside her new employer, heading west out of Placerville. The road followed a winding creek, climbing gradually through rolling hills dotted with oak trees and patches of wildflowers. The landscape was nothing like the manicured gardens and crowded streets of Boston, but Flora found herself appreciating its wild beauty. Quinn Blackburn drove with competent hands, occasionally pointing out landmarks or naming distant mountain peaks. He didn't press her for information about herself, which both relieved and puzzled her. In Boston, curiosity about newcomers bordered on interrogation. "It's not what you're used to," he said as they crested a hill and the ranch came into view. "But it's peaceful." A modest 2-story house stood in a clearing, with several outbuildings clustered nearby: a barn, corral, smokehouse, and what appeared to be a bunkhouse. A sprawling vegetable garden grew beside the house, and chickens scratched in the yard. Beyond stretched fenced pastures where cattle grazed, and beyond that, forested mountains rose against the sky. "It's lovely," Flora said, surprised to find she meant it. After weeks of travel and anxiety, the quiet ranch seemed almost welcoming. Quinn guided the wagon to the house and helped her down with a strong hand that released her the moment her feet touched the ground. Respectful, she noted with relief. The last thing she needed was unwanted attention. The interior of the house was simply furnished but clean, with worn but quality furniture, braided rugs on the plank floors, and windows that let in ample light. A massive stone fireplace dominated the main room, with a kitchen and dining area off to one side. Stairs led to what she assumed were bedrooms above. "Your room is upstairs, first door on the right," Quinn said, carrying her trunk as effortlessly as if it contained feathers rather than everything she owned in the world. "Mine's at the end of the hall. There's a spare room between that I use for storage." Flora followed him up the stairs, noting the solid construction of the house. This was no hastily built frontier cabin, but a home meant to last generations. The bedroom was plain but pleasant, with a comfortable-looking bed, washstand, chest of drawers, and rocking chair near the window that overlooked the mountains. "I'll leave you to settle in," Quinn said, setting down her trunk. "Supper's at 6. "Nothing fancy. I've been cooking for myself, and I'm no chef." "I'll prepare the meal," Flora offered quickly, eager to earn her keep. "Once I've had a chance to freshen up," he nodded, seeming pleased by her initiative. "Kitchen's stocked. Use whatever you find." Left alone, Flora sank onto the bed, overwhelmed by the swift change in her circumstances. 24 hours ago, she'd arrived in an unfamiliar town with no connections and limited prospects. Now she had shelter, employment, and at least temporary security. The problem, of course, was Quinn Blackburn himself. Not that he'd been anything but respectful, but his quiet confidence and those startlingly blue eyes made her uncomfortable in ways she couldn't quite name. Flora had learned the hard way that men couldn't be trusted, no matter how honorable they might appear. Her fiancé in Boston, Theodore Livingston, had professed undying love right until the moment her father's financial ruin was revealed. Then he disappeared with remarkable speed, leaving her to face the scandal alone. When whispers of fraud and embezzlement began circulating after her father's death, Theodore had joined the chorus of accusers. No, Flora decided as she unpinned her travel-worn hair and washed her face in the cool water from the washstand pitcher. She would maintain a strictly professional relationship with Quinn Blackburn. This arrangement was temporary, just until she could save enough money to move on, perhaps to San Francisco, where a single woman might find respectable employment more easily. In the kitchen, Flora found herself surprisingly well equipped. The pantry contained flour, sugar, coffee, dried beans, rice, and an assortment of preserved fruits and vegetables. The root cellar yielded potatoes, onions, and carrots. A spring house kept milk, butter, and eggs cool. By 6 o'clock, she had prepared a simple but substantial meal: fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, and biscuits. It wasn't elaborate, but it was certainly better than the trail cooking Quinn had likely been doing for himself. He came in from the barn, washing up at the pump outside before entering the kitchen. He stopped short when he saw the table, properly set with the mismatched china she'd found in the cupboard, food steaming in serving dishes. "You said you couldn't cook," he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "I said I had no experience as a housekeeper," Flora corrected, wiping her hands on the apron she'd found hanging behind the pantry door. "I can cook basic meals." Quinn eyed the spread with obvious appreciation. This is a far cry from the beans and bacon I've been living on." They ate in companionable silence for a while, Quinn demolishing 3 pieces of chicken and a small mountain of potatoes before finally sitting back with a satisfied sigh. "Where did you learn to cook like that?" he asked, sipping his coffee. Flora tensed, wary of personal questions. "My mother believed young ladies should understand household management, even if they would eventually have servants to handle the actual work." Hum. Quinn's expression suggested he heard what she wasn't saying, that she came from money, or at least had once. "Well, I'm grateful for her foresight. Best meal I've had in months." After dinner, Flora insisted on washing the dishes herself, establishing her role as housekeeper. Quinn retreated to the porch with a pipe, giving her space to organize the kitchen to her liking. By the time she'd finished, darkness had fallen and the mountain air had turned cool. She found him still on the porch, silhouetted against the starry sky. He stood when she appeared, that innate courtesy again surprising her. "I'll be rising early tomorrow," he said. "But don't feel you need to prepare breakfast before dawn. Your duties can follow your own schedule mostly. I'm not particular about when things get done, just that they do." "I'm an early riser myself," Flora replied. "I'll have something ready." Quinn nodded. "Good night then, Miss Evans. Sleep well." Flora retreated to her room, oddly discomfited by his simple courtesy. In her experience, men always wanted something. Theodore had wanted her family's connections and fortune. The bank manager in town had wanted her body. Quinn Blackburn's apparent lack of demands made her suspicious rather than reassured. True to her word, Flora was awake before dawn, dressing quickly in the chilly room. She chose her plainest dress, a practical navy cotton that wouldn't show dirt easily, and secured her hair in a simple knot at the nape of her neck. Looking in the small mirror above the washstand, she hardly recognized herself. The polished Boston debutante was gone, replaced by a woman with shadows under her eyes and tension around her mouth. The kitchen stove had been banked overnight, and Flora soon had it drawing well, heating water for coffee and mixing biscuit dough. She found bacon and eggs, and by the time heavy footsteps sounded on the stairs, a hearty breakfast waited on the table. Quinn appeared, dressed for work in denims, flannel shirt, and boots, his hair still damp from washing. He paused at the kitchen doorway, surprise evident. "You didn't need to go to all this trouble," he said, but the appreciation in his eyes contradicted his words. "It's no trouble," Flora replied, pouring coffee into a thick mug. "It's what you're paying me for, after all." They settled into a routine over the next few days. Quinn worked from dawn to dusk, managing the small herd of cattle with the help of 2 cowhands who lived in the bunkhouse. Pedro, an older Mexican man with a talent for breaking horses, and Eli, a taciturn fellow with a pronounced limp from an old injury. Flora threw herself into domestic tasks with determination, if not expertise. She cleaned the house from top to bottom, discovering that while Quinn wasn't slovenly, certain areas had clearly suffered from neglect since his previous housekeeper departed. She tended the vegetable garden, gathered eggs, and prepared 3 meals a day. The physical labor was exhausting for someone unused to it, but Flora welcomed the distraction. When her hands were busy, her mind had less opportunity to dwell on the past or worry about the future. Each night she fell into bed too tired to dream, which was a blessing on the 4th day. As she was hanging laundry on the line stretched between 2 apple trees in the yard, Quinn approached from the barn, leading a dappled gray mare. "Thought you might like to see more of the ranch than just the house and garden," he said, stroking the horse's neck. "Maybelle here is gentle as a lamb." "Do you ride?" Flora hesitated. She did know how to ride properly on a side saddle in a riding habit with a groom in attendance. not astride a Western saddle in her work dress, but the opportunity to explore beyond the immediate confines of the house was tempting. "I've had some experience," she admitted cautiously. Quinn's mouth quirked in that almost smile she'd noticed before. "I figured as much. Your hands are too soft for someone who grew up doing manual labor, but you sit straight as a queen at dinner. Someone taught you posture." Flora stiffened, uncomfortable with his perception. "I don't have appropriate riding attire." "The mare won't mind," he said easily. "And neither will I. There's no one out here to scandalize with improper riding habits, Miss Evans." After a moment's hesitation, Flora nodded. "Very well. Let me finish hanging these shirts and I'll join you." 15 minutes later, she stood beside the patient Maybelle, wondering how to mount without making a spectacle of herself. Quinn solved the problem by lacing his fingers together to create a stirrup for her foot, boosting her up with effortless strength. The sensation of sitting astride was odd after years of side saddle, but not uncomfortable. Quinn mounted his own horse, a tall bay gelding, and led her away from the house, following a well-worn trail that wound through oak-studded hills. The June day was perfect warm sunshine, a light breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers and birdsong filling the air. "The property runs all the way to that ridgeline," Quinn said, pointing to distant hills. "About 2,000 acres. Not the biggest spread in these parts, but enough for me." "How long have you had the ranch?" Flora asked, finding it easier to make conversation away from the confines of the house. 7 years. Bought it with money I saved working other men's cattle." There was quiet pride in his voice. "Started with 100 head and built from there." "You've accomplished a great deal," Flora observed, genuinely impressed. In Boston, old money ruled and self-made men were viewed with suspicion regardless of their success. Quinn shrugged. "Got lucky with timing. The war was over, the railroad was expanding, beef prices were good." They rode in silence for a while, cresting a hill that offered views across the valley. In the distance, Placerville was just visible, a collection of buildings nestled between hills. "Why Placerville?" Quinn asked suddenly. "Most Easterners heading west aim for San Francisco or Sacramento." Flora tensed, her guard rising. "How do you know I'm from the East? Your accent, the way you hold yourself, those fancy boots you were wearing in town that weren't made for Western dust." His observation was matter of fact, not accusatory. Flora considered deflecting again, but found herself unexpectedly wanting to offer at least a partial truth. "I needed a fresh start. Somewhere no one knew me." Quinn nodded, accepting this limited explanation. "Most folks out here have a past they don't discuss. It's one of the benefits of the West, you get judged more by what you do now than what you did before." "Is that why you came west?" Flora asked, turning his tactic back on him, the corner of his mouth lifted. "Touché, Miss Evans." He considered for a moment before answering. "I grew up in Kentucky. Father was a horse breeder. Good man, but we didn't see eye to eye. He wanted me to take over the family business. I wanted my own land, my own brand." He shrugged. "So I headed west after the war, worked my way from cowhand to foreman to rancher." It was a simple story, straightforward in a way Flora's complicated history wasn't. She envied him the clean break, the ability to forge his own path without scandal or shame dogging his steps. They continued riding, Quinn pointing out boundaries and features of the land, the creek that never ran dry even in summer, the south pasture where the grass grew thickest, the stands of pine that provided shelter for the cattle in winter. By the time they returned to the ranch house, Flora's muscles ached from the unaccustomed exercise, but she felt more relaxed than she had in months. The land had a soothing effect, vast and unchanging in a way that put human concerns into perspective. "Thank you for the tour," she said as Quinn helped her dismount, his hands strong and steady at her waist. "Your land is beautiful." "It is," he agreed, his eyes not on the landscape but on her face. The intensity of his gaze made her flush, and she stepped back quickly, breaking the brief contact. "I should start supper," she said, smoothing her wrinkled skirt. Quinn nodded, turning his attention to unsaddling the horses. "I need to check on a heifer that's due to calve. I may be late for the meal." Flora hurried back to the house, unsettled by her reaction to Quinn's casual touch. She'd come west to escape the mess her life had become, not to complicate it further with inconvenient feelings for her employer. The days passed, settling into a rhythm of work and meals, brief conversations and longer silences. Flora found herself gradually relaxing, the constant fear that had accompanied her journey west receding somewhat in the isolated security of the ranch. Quinn was unfailingly respectful, maintaining a proper distance while treating her with consideration she hadn't expected. Summer heat settled over the land, bringing long days of sunshine and short, star-filled nights. Flora's pale skin bronzed despite her bonnets and shawls, and her hands grew calloused from work. She discovered unexpected satisfaction in practical tasks, the garden flourishing under her care, bread rising perfectly in the oven, floors gleaming after a thorough scrubbing. On Sundays, Quinn hitched the buggy and drove them into Placerville for church services. Flora wore her best dress, a lavender cotton that was already becoming faded, and sat stiffly beside him in the pew, aware of curious glances from the townspeople. A single woman living on a bachelor's ranch, even as an employee, invited speculation. She heard the whispers, saw the knowing looks exchanged between matrons. After the third Sunday, as they were driving back to the ranch, Flora brought up the subject that had been troubling her. "People are talking about our arrangement." Quinn glanced at her, his expression neutral. "People always talk. Does it bother you?" "I don't want to damage your reputation in the community," she said carefully. He snorted. "My reputation can withstand a bit of gossip, Miss Evans. I'm more concerned about yours." Flora looked away, staring at the passing landscape. "My reputation is already beyond salvaging, Mr. Blackburn, at least in the circles that once mattered to me." It was the closest she'd come to mentioning her past, and Quinn seemed to recognize the significance. He was quiet for a moment before responding. "Whatever happened back east, it doesn't follow you here unless you let it," he said finally. "But if the talk bothers you, we could consider alternatives." "Alternatives?" Flora tensed, suddenly afraid he might be suggesting she leave. "Mrs. Holbrook, the Reverend's wife, mentioned she's looking for help with the church's charity work. Teaching the miners' children to read, organizing aid for widows, that sort of thing. It would get you into town more, establish you as part of the community separate from your position at the ranch." Relief flooded her. "That's a thoughtful suggestion. I do miss teaching." Quinn glanced at her with interest. "You were a teacher," Flora hesitated, then nodded. "Briefly, I taught music to young ladies." It wasn't entirely a lie. She had given piano lessons to the daughters of family friends, though it had been a social arrangement rather than paid employment. But she did know how to teach, and the prospect of using her education in a meaningful way appealed to her. "I'll speak to Mrs. Holbrook next Sunday," she decided. "Thank you for the suggestion." Quinn nodded, his attention returning to the road. "It might be good for you to have interests beyond the ranch. I don't want you feeling isolated." The concern in his voice warmed her in ways she tried not to examine too closely. The following week brought a heat wave that left everyone irritable and lethargic. Flora rose before dawn to complete her outdoor chores while the air was still relatively cool, retreating to the house by mid-morning. She spent the afternoon ironing Quinn's shirts by the open window, hoping to catch any stray breeze. By evening, Dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, promising the relief of a thunderstorm. Quinn and the hands worked late, moving cattle away from the creek that might flood if the rains were heavy. When he finally came in for supper, he was dust-covered and weary, his shirt clinging to his back with sweat. "Storm coming," he said unnecessarily, washing at the kitchen pump. "Might be a bad one. The cattle are restless." Flora served a cold supper: sliced ham, potato salad, and pickled vegetables with apple pie for dessert. Neither of them had much appetite in the oppressive heat, but Quinn ate dutifully, complimenting the meal. As they finished, the first growl of thunder sounded in the distance. Flora moved to the porch to watch the approaching storm, drawn by the dramatic display of nature's power. Lightning flashed across the darkened sky, briefly illuminating the landscape in stark relief. Quinn joined her, keeping a respectful distance. "I've always enjoyed a good thunderstorm," he remarked. "Clears the air, washes everything clean." "We had them in Boston, of course," Flora said, "but they seemed less immediate. Here, there's nothing between us and the sky." "That's what I love about this land." Quinn's voice was thoughtful. "No barriers, no pretense, just honest earth and open sky." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and bringing blessed relief from the heat. Flora closed her eyes, inhaling deeply as the first fat drops began to fall. Within minutes, the gentle patter became a downpour, water cascading from the porch roof in a silvery curtain. A particularly vivid flash of lightning, followed almost immediately by a tremendous crack of thunder, made Flora jump involuntarily. Quinn's hand settled briefly on her shoulder, steadying her. "Maybe we should go inside," he suggested. That strike was close. They retreated to the parlor, leaving the windows open to admit the cooler air. Quinn lit a single lamp, its golden glow creating a cozy island in the storm-darkened room. Outside, rain lashed the house, and wind howled around the eaves. Flora sat in the rocking chair, while Quinn took his usual place in the worn leather armchair near the cold fireplace. For a while, they simply listened to the storm, comfortable in the shared silence. "Did I mention that Reverend Clark is organizing a community gathering next month?" Quinn said eventually. "Harvest celebration, though it's a bit early for most crops. Any excuse for a social, I suppose. Mrs. Holbrook mentioned it when I saw her on Sunday," Flora replied. She'd begun helping with the children's reading lessons after church, finding unexpected joy in the work. "She's quite determined that everyone attend." Quinn smiled slightly. "She's particularly determined that I attend. She's been trying to marry me off to every eligible woman in the county for years." Flora felt an odd twinge at the thought. "Perhaps you should oblige her and court one of these women," she said lightly. "A rancher needs a wife, doesn't he? Someone to provide sons to inherit all this land you've acquired." "Perhaps," Quinn agreed, his eyes steady on her face. "But I'm particular about who I'd share my life with. Marriage isn't something to enter into lightly." "No," Flora said softly, memories of her broken engagement surfacing. "It certainly isn't." Thunder crashed overhead, making the windows rattle. The lamp flickered, throwing strange shadows on the walls. In the intimate dimness, with rain drumming on the roof and wind moaning around the house, Flora felt a dangerous lowering of her defenses. "Why did you really come west, Flora?" Quinn asked quietly, using her given name for the first time. "What were you running from?" The question hung between them, weighted with all the things she hadn't said. For a moment, Flora considered deflecting again, maintaining the careful distance she'd established. But something in Quinn's steady gaze, the genuine concern she saw there, broke through her reserve. "Scandal," she said finally, her voice barely audible above the storm. "My father. He made some poor investments, lost everything. There were accusations of fraud, embezzlement. He couldn't bear the disgrace. She swallowed hard. He shot himself in his study. I found him. Quinn's expression remained calm, though his eyes darkened with sympathy. I'm sorry. After the funeral, my fiancé broke our engagement. Very properly, of course, a note delivered by his manservant. Bitterness crept into her voice. Then the rumors started that I had been involved in my father's schemes, that I had known about the fraud and kept silent. There was talk of investigation, possible arrest. She looked down at her clasped hands. So I sold what little remained and bought a ticket west, as far as I could go. And no one followed, no investigators or lawmen. Flora shook her head. I don't think they truly believed I was guilty. It was just society's way of destroying what remained of my reputation. Boston can be cruel to those who fall from grace. Quinn was silent for a long moment, processing her story. Thank you for trusting me with the truth, he said finally. It explains a great deal about your caution. I've learned that trust is a luxury I can't afford, Flora replied, immediately regretting the unintended rebuke. But Quinn didn't seem offended. Trust has to be earned, he agreed. I hope to earn yours in time. The simple sincerity in his voice touched something deep within Flora, a place she'd thought permanently closed off after Theodore's betrayal. She looked away, unsettled by her own response. It's getting late, she said, rising from the chair, and the storm seems to be passing. Indeed, the thunder had moved off, though rain still fell steadily. Quinn stood as well, respectful of her desire to end the conversation. Good night, Flora, he said quietly. Sleep well. In her room, Flora undressed slowly, her mind replaying their conversation. She hadn't intended to reveal so much, yet found herself oddly unburdened by having done so. Quinn's calm acceptance of her story, without judgment or excessive sympathy, had been exactly what she needed. The problem, of course, was that it made him more dangerous to her peace of mind. Flora had come west determined to rely only on herself, to build a life that couldn't be destroyed by a man's actions or betrayal. Developing feelings for Quinn Blackburn would undermine that resolve, and she was developing feelings, Flora admitted to herself as she lay in bed listening to the rain. She admired his quiet competence, his fairness with the ranch hands, his respect for her position. She enjoyed their conversations, the way he listened attentively to her opinions. And yes, she found him physically attractive, the strength in his hands, the way the sun had bronzed his skin, the rare smile that transformed his serious face. It was foolish, she told herself sternly. Quinn was her employer, nothing more. Whatever kindness he showed was simply his nature, not special consideration for her. And even if he did harbor some interest, Flora wasn't ready to risk her heart again so soon after Theodore's betrayal. With these stern admonitions, she finally drifted off to sleep, the sound of rain a gentle lullaby. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Summer moved toward fall, bringing cooler days and earlier sunsets. The garden yielded a bounty of vegetables that kept Flora busy canning and preserving for winter. Quinn and the hands began the process of selecting cattle for the autumn drive to market, a major source of the ranch's income. Flora continued helping at the church, expanding her role from reading lessons to organizing a small choir among the children. Her initial wariness around the townspeople gradually eased as they accepted her presence without too many questions about her past. Mrs. Holbrook proved to be a staunch ally, smoothing Flora's integration into the community with well-placed words and introductions to suitable friends. If she wondered about Flora's arrangement at the Blackburn Ranch, she kept such thoughts to herself, treating Flora with genuine warmth and respect. The harvest celebration was scheduled for the second Saturday in September, when the weather would still be pleasant enough for an outdoor gathering. The entire community was involved in preparations, ranchers donating beef for barbecue, farmers providing corn and vegetables, ladies organizing tables of pies and cakes. "Are you planning to attend?" Flora asked Quinn at breakfast, a week before the event. She'd been helping Mrs. Holbrook with decorations but hadn't confirmed her own attendance. Quinn looked up from his coffee. "Thought I might. Eli and Pedro can watch the ranch for an evening." "Mrs. Holbrook mentioned there will be dancing," Flora said, trying to sound casual as she refilled his cup. "So I hear." Quinn watched her with that steady gaze that always made her feel he could see more than she intended to reveal. "Do you dance, Miss Evans?" Flora had returned to the more formal address after their conversation during the storm, a small but deliberate distancing she suspected Quinn had noticed. "I was taught the appropriate dances for Boston society," she replied. "I doubt they're the same as frontier celebrations." Quinn's mouth quirked. "Probably not, but the principle is the same, moving together to music." He hesitated, then added, "I'd be honored if you'd save me a dance." Flora felt a flush rising in her cheeks. "I'll consider it, Mr. Blackburn." His smile deepened. "I suppose that's better than an outright refusal." The day of the celebration dawned clear and mild, perfect weather for an outdoor gathering. Flora spent extra time on her appearance, washing her hair and arranging it more elaborately than her usual practical style. She chose her best dress, the lavender cotton, freshly washed and pressed, with lace collar and cuffs she'd carefully salvaged from one of her Boston gowns. Quinn was equally attentive to his appearance, emerging from his room in clean denims, a white shirt with actual starch in the collar, and a dark vest that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. He'd trimmed his beard and slicked back his hair, transforming from rugged rancher to a man who wouldn't have looked entirely out of place in a Boston drawing room. "You look very nice," Flora said, surprised by the change. "As do you," Quinn replied, his eyes appreciative but respectful. "That color suits you." They drove to town in the buggy, joining a steady stream of wagons and riders all heading for the town square. Placerville had transformed itself for the occasion, colorful bunting draped from buildings, tables arranged in the shade of oak trees, a platform erected for the musicians. Lanterns hung from branches, ready to be lit when darkness fell. Mrs. Holbrook greeted them warmly, drawing Flora into the group of ladies arranging the food tables, while Quinn moved off to speak with the ranchers gathered near the barbecue pits. The separation was both a relief and a disappointment. As the afternoon progressed, Flora found herself enjoying the celebration more than she'd expected. The townspeople were genuinely friendly, the food was excellent, and the atmosphere festive without being rowdy. She helped serve pie, joined in community singing, and applauded the children's recitations organized by the schoolteacher. As dusk approached, the musicians began tuning their instruments, fiddles, guitar, and a battered piano dragged onto the platform. Lanterns were lit, casting a golden glow over the square. Couples began gathering for the dancing, an eclectic mix of formal attire and practical frontier clothing. Flora stood at the edge of the gathering, watching as the first dance began, a lively reel that had couples laughing as they navigated the steps. She hadn't seen Quinn for some time and wondered if he'd changed his mind about dancing. "Miss Evans." His voice came from behind her, and she turned to find him offering a cup of punch. "Thought you might be thirsty." "Thank you." She accepted the cup, noting that he'd removed his hat, his dark hair still neatly combed despite the evening breeze. They stood in companionable silence, watching the dancers. When the music changed to a slower waltz, Quinn turned to her with a slight bow. "May I have this dance?" he asked formally, extending his hand. Flora hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. "You may, Mr. Blackburn." His hand at her waist was respectfully placed, his grip on her fingers firm but gentle as he led her into the dance. Flora was surprised to discover he moved with grace, guiding her smoothly around the makeshift dance floor. "You dance very well," she observed, looking up at him. "My mother insisted all her sons learn, said it was a necessary skill for gentlemen." There was a hint of amusement in his voice. "I haven't had much occasion to practice out here." "How many brothers do you have?" Flora asked, realizing how little she knew about his family. "Two. Both still in Kentucky, running the family horse farm with my father." Something like regret crossed his face briefly. "We write occasionally, but it's been years since I've seen them." "Do you miss them?" Flora found herself genuinely curious. Quinn considered the question seriously. "Sometimes. Family connections aren't easily replaced, but we chose different paths." The music carried them around the floor, and Flora gradually relaxed into the familiar rhythm of the waltz. It had been so long since she'd danced, not since the last Boston society ball before her father's death. This was different, less formal, more genuine somehow. Quinn held her with care but not distance, his eyes warm whenever they met hers. All too soon, the music ended. Quinn released her waist but kept hold of her hand as he escorted her from the dance floor. "Thank you," he said simply. "It's been a long time since I've enjoyed a dance so much." Flora was saved from having to respond by the arrival of Mrs. Holbrook, flushed with excitement and organizing. "Oh, Miss Evans, there you are. The children are asking for you. They want to perform that song you've been teaching them." She looked between Flora and Quinn with undisguised interest. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Flora assured her, grateful for the distraction. The warmth in Quinn's eyes was becoming difficult to ignore. "I'd be happy to help with the children's song." The remainder of the evening passed in a whirl of activity. Flora led the children in singing a simple hymn she'd taught them, receiving enthusiastic applause from the proud parents. She danced again, this time with the blacksmith and then with Reverend Clark, carefully avoiding being available when Quinn might ask for a second dance. It was well past midnight when they finally headed back to the ranch, the buggy rolling along the moonlit road in comfortable silence. Flora was tired but content, the evening having gone better than she dared hope. "Did you enjoy yourself?" Quinn asked as they approached the ranch house, its dark outline just visible against the starry sky. "I did," Flora admitted. "More than I expected to. The people here are very kind." "Placerville grows on you," Quinn agreed. "It's not sophisticated, but it's genuine." He helped her down from the buggy, his hands lingering slightly at her waist. In the moonlight, his face was partially shadowed, but she could feel the intensity of his gaze. "Thank you for the dance," he said quietly, "and for gracing my arm at the celebration. You brought a certain distinction to the proceedings that didn't go unnoticed." Flora felt herself blushing in the darkness. "I did nothing special. You were yourself," Quinn replied simply. "That's special enough." The compliment left her momentarily speechless. Before she could formulate a response, Quinn stepped back, breaking the moment. "It's late. We should both get some rest." Flora nodded, gathering her skirts to climb the porch steps. At the door, she paused, looking back at him. "Good night, Quinn." His name felt right on her lips, the formality of Mr. Blackburn suddenly unnecessary between them. His smile in response was worth the small risk of familiarity. "Good night, Flora. Sleep well." That night, Flora dreamed of dancing, of strong hands guiding her through unfamiliar steps, of blue eyes watching her with quiet appreciation. She woke feeling unsettled, the growing attraction she felt for Quinn becoming harder to deny. The days following the harvest celebration brought a noticeable shift in their relationship. Quinn began joining Flora for evening walks around the property, ostensibly to check on various projects, but clearly seeking her company. Their conversations deepened, ranging beyond the practical matters of running the ranch to books they'd read, places they'd visited, ideas about the changing nation. Flora found herself looking forward to these walks, to the way Quinn listened attentively to her opinions, offering his own thoughts without attempting to override hers. It was refreshing after the patronizing attitudes of Boston gentlemen, who rarely considered a woman's views worthy of serious consideration. As September gave way to October, the ranch became busier with preparations for winter. Quinn and the hands selected 30 head of cattle for the drive to Sacramento, where they would be sold to supply the growing city. The drive would take at least a week, possibly longer depending on weather and trail conditions. The evening before his departure, Quinn found Flora in the garden, harvesting the last of the summer vegetables before the first frost. "I've asked Mrs. Holbrook to check on you while I'm gone," he said, helping her fill the basket with tomatoes. "Pedro will stay behind to handle things here, but I'd feel better knowing someone from town was looking in as well." "I'm perfectly capable of managing on my own," Flora replied, though she was touched by his concern. "I don't doubt it." Quinn's eyes crinkled at the corners. "But humor me. It's a long ride to Sacramento, and I'll worry less knowing you're not completely alone out here." Flora nodded, conceding the point. "Very well. I appreciate the consideration." They walked back to the house together, the setting sun painting the landscape in gold and amber. At the porch steps, Quinn paused, turning to face her. "I've been meaning to ask you something," he said, his expression suddenly serious. "Your position here was meant to be temporary until you found something more suitable. It's been nearly 4 months now." Flora's heart sank. Was he asking her to leave? Had she misread his growing attentiveness? "I've been satisfied with the arrangement," she said carefully. "But if you're no longer in need of my services, that's not what I'm asking," Quinn interrupted gently. "Just the opposite, in fact. I'm wondering if you'd consider making the position permanent. The ranch runs better with you here. The house feels more like a home." Relief washed over her, followed quickly by caution. "What exactly are you proposing, Quinn?" His gaze was steady, direct. "For now, exactly what we have you continuing as housekeeper with fair wages and your own room. But I won't pretend I don't hope for more, eventually. When you're ready." He took a deep breath. "I care for you, Flora, more than I expected to, more than might be proper given our current arrangement." The confession hung between them, honest and unadorned. Flora found herself both touched by his straightforwardness and terrified by the implications. "I don't know if I can give you what you want," she said finally. "My experience with such matters hasn't been positive." Quinn nodded, accepting this without offense. "I understand. I'm not asking for promises, just honesty, and the chance to prove that not all men are like your former fiancé." "How can I be sure?" The question escaped before she could censor it, revealing more vulnerability than she'd intended. "You can't," Quinn answered simply. "Not with absolute certainty. That's the risk of trusting anyone, but I hope my actions have shown something of my character." Flora couldn't deny that they had. In the months she'd lived at the ranch, Quinn had been unfailingly honorable, respectful of her boundaries while offering genuine kindness and consideration. "I need time," she said finally. "Time to be sure of my own feelings, apart from gratitude for the position and security you've provided." "Time you shall have," Quinn agreed readily. "I'm not a man who rushes important decisions." He hesitated, then asked, "But you will stay, at least for now?" "I'll stay," Flora promised. "The ranch has become important to me." Quinn's smile was warm with relief. "That's enough for now." He touched her hand briefly, the contact sending a shiver of awareness through her. "I should finish packing. We leave at dawn." After he'd gone, Flora remained on the porch, watching the last light fade from the sky. Quinn's declaration had not been entirely unexpected, given the direction of their relationship in recent weeks, but it still left her feeling unbalanced. The easy security of their employer-employee relationship had been comfortable, a clear delineation of roles that protected her heart. Now she would have to confront her own feelings, decide whether she was brave enough to risk trusting again after Theodore's cruel abandonment. The comparison between the two men was unavoidable: Theodore with his polished manners and empty promises, Quinn with his straightforward honesty and quiet strength. The week of Quinn's absence gave Flora plenty of time for reflection. The ranch seemed emptier without his presence, the days longer, the silence more profound. She kept busy with her usual tasks and added some extra projects: deep cleaning the parlor, organizing the storage pantry, mending Quinn's work shirts. Mrs. Holbrook visited twice, bringing news from town and thinly veiled curiosity about Flora's situation. Though the older woman never asked directly, her hints about a woman's natural place and the blessings of matrimony made her hopes for a match between Flora and Quinn abundantly clear. On the 7th day, Flora was kneading bread dough when she heard hoofbeats in the yard. Her heart leapt before she could temper the reaction. Wiping flour from her hands, she moved to the window, watching as Quinn and Ellie rode in, both men looking tired but satisfied. She resisted the urge to run out to greet them, instead returning to her bread-making with forced calmness. Quinn would come in when he was ready, after seeing to the horses and washing off the trail dust. 20 minutes later, the kitchen door opened, and Quinn appeared, his hair damp from washing, wearing a clean shirt though his denim still bore the evidence of hard travel. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes finding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Welcome home," Flora said, suddenly shy despite the weeks of growing familiarity. "It's good to be back," Quinn replied, his voice warming the simple phrase into something more meaningful. He moved further into the kitchen, drawn by the scent of baking. "Something smells wonderful." "Apple pie," Flora explained, gesturing to the cooling rack. "And beef stew for supper. I thought you might appreciate a hearty meal after trail food." "You thought right." Quinn's smile was tired but genuine. The drive was successful, got better prices than expected for the cattle. Enough to see us comfortably through winter and still put some aside. The casual us wasn't lost on Flora. She busied herself with setting the bread to rise, avoiding his gaze. "I'm glad it went well. Did you have any trouble on the trail?" Quinn leaned against the counter, watching her work. "Nothing serious. One day of rain that made the going slow, a minor disagreement with another outfit over watering rights that we settled peaceably." He hesitated, then added, "I missed this place. Missed you." The simple statement, delivered without embellishment, touched Flora more deeply than elaborate declarations might have. She looked up, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since his return. "I missed you too," she admitted quietly. "The ranch feels different when you're away." The smile that spread across Quinn's face made him look younger, less careworn. "That's good to hear." He straightened, moving toward the door. "I should help Ellie finish unloading. We brought supplies from Sacramento: flour, sugar, coffee, some fabric Mrs. Holbrook suggested might be useful." "You bought fabric?" Flora was surprised by the thoughtfulness. "Figured you might need something new for winter," Quinn said with a shrug, as if it were a small matter. "Mrs. Holbrook said green would suit you. I hope that was right." The considerate gesture, so at odds with Theodore's self-centered nature, struck Flora forcefully. That was very kind, thank you. Quinn nodded, a faint flush coloring his tanned face. Supper at the usual time? Yes, of course. After he'd gone, Flora stood motionless in the kitchen, emotions churning. The contrast between Quinn and Theodore had never been clearer. Theodore had given her expensive gifts to showcase his wealth and taste, always with an eye to how her appearance reflected on him. Quinn had bought simple fabric because he thought she might need something warm for winter, chosen in a color that would flatter her. It was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain her emotional distance, to protect herself from the growing attachment she felt toward this quiet, honorable man. That evening, after a hearty supper during which Quinn recounted more details of the cattle drive, they sat on the porch despite the autumn chill. The stars were brilliant overhead, the night air crisp and clean. Did you think about what we discussed before I left? Quinn asked finally, breaking the comfortable silence. About your staying on permanently, Flora nodded slowly. I did, a great deal. And his voice was carefully neutral, giving no indication of his hopes. I'm still cautious, Flora admitted. Not because of any doubt about your character, but because of my own fears. She drew a deep breath. But I've decided to stay, at least through winter, and to be open to the possibility of more between us if that develops naturally. Quinn's expression remained calm, but she saw the relief and pleasure in his eyes. That seems sensible. No need to rush decisions of the heart. My heart has proven rather poor at decision-making in the past, Flora said ruefully. Perhaps it just needed better options to choose from, Quinn suggested with a hint of humor. Flora found herself smiling in response. Perhaps. The winter of 1876-77 proved to be relatively mild by Sierra Nevada standards, with enough snow to make travel difficult but not impossible. The ranch settled into a quieter rhythm, with fewer outdoor projects and more time spent in the cozy warmth of the house. Flora found herself enjoying the change of pace. Long evenings were spent in the parlor, Quinn reading aloud from books ordered from Sacramento while she worked on sewing projects, including a new dress from the green fabric he'd brought. Sundays still meant church in Placerville when the roads were passable, followed by visits with the Hallbrooks or other friends they'd made in the community. The changing season brought a gradual shift in Flora and Quinn's relationship as well. The careful distance she'd maintained began to erode, replaced by a growing ease in his company. Small touches became more frequent, his hand at her elbow helping her from the buggy, their fingers brushing as she passed him coffee, his palm warm against the small of her back as they entered the church together. Christmas brought a special tenderness to their evolving connection. Quinn surprised her with a small pine tree cut from the higher elevations of the property, set up in the parlor and decorated with paper chains, dried berries, and a few glass ornaments ordered from Sacramento. Flora, in turn, secretly made him a new shirt and knitted scarf, wrapping them in brown paper tied with red ribbon. On Christmas Eve, after a simple but special supper, they sat before the fire in the parlor, the room lit only by the flames and the candles on the little tree. Outside, snow was falling gently, muffling the world in white silence. I have something for you, Quinn said, reaching into his pocket. It's not much, but when I saw it, I thought of you. He handed her a small package wrapped in tissue paper. Flora unwrapped it carefully to reveal a silver brooch in the shape of a flower, delicate petals surrounding a small pearl center. It's beautiful, she breathed, touching it gently. Like its namesake, Quinn said softly. Flora flower. She looked up, meeting his gaze in the firelight. The tenderness she saw there made her throat tighten with emotion. Thank you, she managed. I have something for you as well. Quinn seemed genuinely surprised and touched by her gifts, immediately replacing his worn scarf with the new one, running appreciative fingers over the careful stitching of the shirt. "No one's made me clothing since my mother, years ago," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "Thank you, Flora." The moment felt weighted with possibility. Flora found herself leaning toward him almost unconsciously, drawn by the warmth in his eyes. Quinn remained still, allowing her to determine the pace of their closening. Gathering her courage, Flora closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a gentle, tentative kiss. Quinn responded with equal gentleness, one hand coming up to cup her cheek with exquisite care. When they parted, his eyes searched hers, questioning without words. Flora nodded slightly, answering the unspoken inquiry. Yes, this was what she wanted. Yes, she was choosing this connection, this man, this possible future. Quinn smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "Merry Christmas, Flora," he said softly. "Merry Christmas, Quinn." That kiss on Christmas Eve marked a turning point. While they maintained propriety, Flora still occupied her separate bedroom, and their behavior in public remained entirely proper. The pretense that they were merely employer and employee had been abandoned. They were courting in the old-fashioned sense of the word, learning each other's hearts and minds with deliberate care. Winter gave way to spring, bringing new life to the ranch, calves in the pastures, seedlings in the garden, wildflowers carpeting the hillsides. Flora found herself blossoming as well. The cautious, wounded woman who had arrived in Placerville gradually replaced by someone more confident, more willing to trust, more open to joy. On a perfect April day, with the mountains still snow-capped, but the valley brilliant with green, Quinn asked Flora to ride with him to his favorite spot on the property, a hillside overlooking the entire ranch, with views stretching to distant peaks. "I come here when I need to think," he explained as they dismounted, tethering the horses to a gnarled oak, "or when I want to remember why all the hard work is worthwhile." They spread a blanket on the new grass, sitting side by side to admire the panoramic view. Below them, the ranch buildings looked like a child's toys, the cattle mere dots in the pastures. Beyond stretched forests, hills, and finally mountains, an endless tapestry of wild beauty. "When I first came west," Quinn said after a comfortable silence, "I had no real plan beyond escaping my father's expectations. I worked ranches from Texas to California, saving every dollar, learning the business from the ground up." His gaze swept over the land before them. "Then I saw this property neglected, run down, but with good water and better prospects. Something in me just knew this was where I belonged." Flora understood the feeling. "It has that effect," she agreed softly. "A sense of rightness." Quinn turned to her, his expression serious. "Flora, I've been thinking a great deal about belonging, about home and what makes a place more than just land and buildings." He took her hand, his grip warm and steady. "When you arrived last summer, this was already a successful ranch, but it wasn't truly a home until you were here." Flora's heart quickened, sensing the direction of his words. "I know you came west to escape," Quinn continued, "to find somewhere new to belong. I'm hoping—" He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I'm hoping you might consider belonging here with me, not as my housekeeper but as my wife." Though she had anticipated this moment might come, the reality of it still left Flora momentarily speechless. Quinn waited patiently, his blue eyes steady on hers, giving her the time she needed. "Before I answer," Flora said finally, "there's something I need to say." She drew a deep breath. "When I first came here, I was broken in ways I didn't fully understand. I thought I could never trust again, never believe in love or loyalty." Her voice softened. "You changed that, Quinn. Not with grand gestures or passionate declarations, but with consistent kindness, with respect, with honesty. She squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his touch. "The first night we met, do you remember what I said? That I didn't belong anywhere?" Quinn nodded, his expression intent. "You told me I could belong to your porch and your sky." Flora smiled at the memory. "It seemed like such a strange offer at the time, but now I understand what you meant. You were offering me a place to heal, to find myself again." She met his gaze directly. "Yes, Quinn Blackburn, I would be honored to be your wife, to belong here with you." The joy that transformed his face was answer enough, but Quinn sealed their engagement with a kiss that promised a lifetime of belonging. When they finally parted, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "This was my grandmother's," he explained, opening it to reveal a simple gold band set with a small but perfect sapphire. "My mother sent it when I wrote to tell her about you. She says it's high time it was worn again." Flora gasped softly. "You wrote to your family about me?" Quinn nodded, slipping the ring onto her finger. "Told them I'd found a woman with more courage and grace than anyone I'd ever known. A woman who makes me want to be better than I am." His smile was tender. "They're eager to meet you, my mother especially. You want me to meet your family." The prospect was both thrilling and terrifying. "Eventually, when you're ready." Quinn wrapped his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. "No rush, we have time now." They sat together on the hillside, watching as the afternoon sun gilded the landscape, turning ordinary trees and fields into a golden paradise. Flora felt a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible, a certainty that she had found her place in the world. "When should we marry?" she asked finally, practical matters intruding on the perfect moment. Quinn considered. "May is a good month for weddings. The weather's fair, the worst of spring work is done." He glanced at her. "Unless that's too soon," Flora shook her head. "Not too soon. I've no need for elaborate preparations," she smiled. "Besides, Mrs. Holbrook will be beside herself with excitement. She's been planning this wedding since the day we met, I suspect." Quinn laughed, the sound echoing across the hillside. "No doubt, she's a determined matchmaker." He sobered slightly. "Would you want to be married in the church, or here on the ranch?" "The church, I think," Flora decided. "We're part of the community now. It seems right to celebrate with them." Quinn nodded his agreement. "A church wedding it is, nothing fancy but proper." His eyes twinkled. "Though I expect you'll need a new dress, something finer than my humble offering of green fabric." "I think I can manage that," Flora said, already planning. The money she'd saved from her wages, carefully hoarded these past months, would be enough for wedding finery. They lingered on the hillside until the sun began to set, reluctant to end the perfect moment but eventually conceding to practical necessities. The ride back to the ranch was filled with quiet contentment, plans for their future interspersed with comfortable silences. As they approached the house, golden in the last light of day, Flora was struck by how completely her perspective had changed. What had once been merely shelter, a temporary haven, was now home in the deepest sense of the word. Quinn helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist. "Welcome home, Flora," he said softly, as if reading her thoughts. "I am home," she agreed, reaching up to touch his face. "I belong here now." His smile was all the confirmation she needed. "You always did. It just took you a while to realize it." The wedding of Quinn Blackburn and Flora Evans took place on a perfect May morning in 1877, with the entire community of Placerville in attendance. The small church was decorated with spring flowers, the altar draped with white cloth embroidered by the ladies of the congregation. Flora wore a gown of ivory silk, ordered from Sacramento with her saved wages, simple in design but elegantly fitted. Mrs. Holbrook had insisted on lending her a lace veil that had been in her family for generations, something borrowed for the occasion. The sapphire ring on her finger provided something blue, while the silver flower brooch Quinn had given her for Christmas was pinned at her throat as something new. Quinn, standing tall and straight at the altar in a new suit, watched with undisguised adoration as Flora walked down the aisle on Reverend Clark's arm, having no father to give her away. His blue eyes never left hers throughout the ceremony, his voice steady and sure as he spoke his vows. I, Quinn Blackburn, take thee, Flora Evans, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part. Flora's voice trembled slightly as she repeated her own vows, emotion making it difficult to speak clearly. But her heart was certain, her commitment absolute, as she promised herself to this man who had shown her what true love looked like: patient, kind, respectful, enduring. The celebration afterward was joyous, the entire town sharing in their happiness with a feast spread under the oak trees in the square. There was dancing and laughter, toasts and well wishes, the community enfolding them in collective goodwill. As evening approached, they slipped away to the waiting buggy, decorated with ribbons and flowers by well-meaning friends. Quinn handed Flora up to the seat with care, then climbed up beside her, taking the reins in his capable hands. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Blackburn?" he asked, his voice warm with the new name. Flora leaned against his shoulder, contentment filling her heart. "More than ready, Mr. Blackburn." The journey back to the ranch seemed shorter than usual, anticipation lending wings to the horses' hooves. When they arrived, Quinn surprised her by lifting her bodily from the seat, carrying her across the threshold of the house that was now truly theirs together. "Welcome home, wife," he said, setting her gently on her feet in the parlor. "Thank you, husband," Flora replied, the words still new and wonderful on her tongue. That night, in the master bedroom that had been Quinn's alone until now, they discovered the final dimension of belonging, the physical union that bound them as completely as their vows. Quinn was as gentle and considerate in this as he had been in all things, guiding Flora through initial uncertainty to joy with patient tenderness. Afterward, lying in his arms as moonlight filtered through the curtains, Flora felt a profound sense of rightness, of completion. The journey that had begun in fear and flight had led her here, to this man, this home, this life. "Happy?" Quinn asked softly, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "Perfectly," Flora assured him, pressing a kiss to his chest just above his heart. "I never imagined I could feel this. Complete. This is just the beginning," Quinn promised. "We have a lifetime ahead of us." The years proved him right. Their life together unfolded with the changing seasons, each day building on the foundation of trust and love they had established. The ranch prospered under their joint care, expanding gradually as Quinn acquired adjacent properties, increasing their cattle herd and diversifying into horse breeding, a nod to his Kentucky roots. Flora found her own place in the community, continuing her work with the church, but also establishing a small school on the ranch for the children of neighboring properties too far from town for daily attendance. Her natural talent for teaching, combined with the education she'd received in Boston, made her an excellent instructor, respected throughout the county. Their first child, a son they named William after Quinn's father, arrived exactly a year after their wedding, a strong, healthy boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's quiet determination. 2 years later, Sarah joined the family, a lively girl with a quick mind and quicker smile. Benjamin completed their family 3 years after that, a thoughtful child with a natural affinity for the land and animals. As the children grew, the ranch became a place of laughter and learning, hard work and simple pleasures. Quinn proved to be an attentive father, teaching his sons to ride, rope, and respect the land, showing his daughter that her intelligence and independence were valuable assets. Flora ensured they all received a thorough education, balancing book learning with practical skills. Through it all, Quinn and Flora's relationship remained the solid center of their world. The tenderness of their early days deepened into a profound partnership, each complementing the other's strengths, supporting each other through inevitable challenges, drought years, illnesses, the ordinary difficulties of raising children and managing a large property. On their 25th wedding anniversary, with their children grown or nearly so, William running his own ranch nearby, Sarah attending university in San Francisco with plans to become a physician, Benjamin apprenticing with a master horseman in Kentucky, Quinn surprised Flora with a special gift. He led her to the hillside where he had proposed, now accessible by a well-maintained path, where he'd arranged a picnic much like that long-ago day. As they sat together, looking out over the ranch that had flourished under their care, he handed her a small package. Inside was a journal bound in soft leather, its pages filled with Quinn's neat handwriting. "What's this?" Flora asked, turning it curiously in her hands. "Our story," Quinn explained. "From the day you stepped off that stagecoach looking lost and determined all at once. I started writing it down years ago, thinking our children might want to know someday how their parents found each other." Flora was deeply touched. She began reading random passages, smiling at Quinn's perspective on events she remembered well: their first meeting, the thunderstorm that had prompted her first confidences, the harvest dance, his proposal on this very hillside. "You saw so much more than I realized," she said, looking up at him with wonder. Quinn's smile was gentle, the lines around his eyes deepened by years of sun and laughter. "I saw you, Flora, from the very beginning, a woman of extraordinary courage who didn't know her own strength." "You helped me find it," she replied, reaching for his hand. "When I arrived in Placerville, I was so certain I would never belong anywhere again. And now—" His thumb traced patterns on her palm, the gesture familiar yet still capable of sending warmth through her. Flora looked out over the land that had become her home, then back to the man who had made it possible. "Now I know exactly where I belong, with you on this porch under this sky." Quinn's eyes, still as blue and direct as the day they'd met, held hers with loving certainty. "Always," he promised. "For all our days," and so it proved to be. Through the changing years, as their children established their own lives and grandchildren eventually joined the family, as Placerville grew from frontier town to established community, as the 19th century gave way to the 20th with its remarkable changes, Quinn and Flora Blackburn remained steadfast in their belonging to each other and to the land they shared. Their story became part of local legend, the Boston Lady and the Kentucky Cowboy who found each other in the California foothills, building a life and legacy that would endure long after they were gone. But for Flora, the true miracle was simpler and more profound. The journey from "I don't belong" to the deep certainty that she belonged exactly where she was, with the man who had offered her his porch and his sky, and in doing so, had given her the world.